Today we will be talking about how the war in Ukraine is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia, but has become de facto a proxy war between the West and Russia, played on the territory of Ukraine. You could go further and say this has also been played on the territory of Israel, which Russia's allies like Iran are also trying to destroy. But let's focus on Ukraine as a battleground between the West and Russia for now. If we look at slide 2, one of the, I think, mistakes that many journalists and others make is to assume that populist nationalists who are rising in support throughout Europe, and of course one was just elected in the United States, are all somehow pro-Russian. And I think this is very simplistic, and it doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground. There are, of course, pro-Russian populist nationalists like Hungary, Orban, and Prime Minister Fico in Slovakia. But I wouldn't say that these are reflective of Europe in general, and even of the United States. I mean, for example, the idea that somehow Trump was a kind of a Russian agent or something similar is way exaggerated. Yes, you could potentially label him as a useful idiot at times, because he's a narcissist, and so Russians could play that up. But the idea that somehow he's some Russian card-carrying agent is, I think, going way off tangent. And there are many examples to show this. Trump's presidency was far more tougher on Russia than Obama's, his predecessor. Obama vetoed weapons supplies to Ukraine. Trump did not veto them. So ironically, the first American weapons to come to Ukraine were under Trump. Also, Trump imposed sanctions on the German-Russian Nord Stream pipeline. This was something which was, of course, good for Ukraine, because the whole point of Nord Stream was to bypass gas deliveries through Ukraine into Europe. When Biden came to power in 2020, he removed those sanctions on Nord Stream. So both Obama and Biden, at least Biden up until the full-scale invasion in February 22, were quite soft on Russia in many ways compared to Trump. Also, it's not so simple when you look at American presidents going back to 1991. You've had both Republican and Democrats who have been pro-Ukrainian, or not really pro-Ukrainian, but pro-Russian. So it's been a real mix. President Bill Clinton was very different to President Obama towards Ukraine. Clinton being pro-Ukrainian, Obama just being indifferent to both Ukraine and to Syria and Georgia as well. Whereas I would say probably the most pro-Ukrainian US president would have been President George Bush in 2008. But it's clearly not black and white. In Europe itself, you have populist nationalists throughout the continent, and they are very different in their stances. Most of them are actually anti-Russian. For example, in Poland, Law and Justice Party, who were in power at the time of Russia's full-scale invasion, were very pro-Ukrainian, very anti-Russian, even though ideologically you could say they are very similar to Orban's Fidesz in Hungary. In Italy, the populist nationalist right came to power, again anti-Putin, pro-Ukrainian. Scandinavia is the same, where you have populist nationalists throughout the 4 countries of Scandinavia, but none of them are pro-Russian. Holland is a bit of a mix. Wilde, the leader of the populist nationalists there, is has at times been pro-Russian, but of course he's restrained in the Netherlands by the fact that most of the 300 or nearly 300 civilians murdered on the civilian airliner MH17 in July 2014 were Dutch. So there isn't much support for a pro-Russian stance inside in Holland and the Netherlands. And you can see that with the new General Secretary of NATO, former Prime Minister of Holland, Rutte, Mark Rutte, who was very pro-Ukrainian as well. France potentially is an odd case. Certainly Le Pen has been in bed with Putin in the past, but she has toned down her pro-Russianism to try to sort of appeal to a broader spectrum of French public opinion in more recent years. When we look at the kind of things that unite many of these populist nationalists and of course the Putin team, the Kremlin, one of the areas has to be this fondness for conspiracies. In the Russian case, this has been inherited from the Soviet Union. This kind of conspiracy mindset has been around for decades in the former Soviet Union. I still see it today amongst many Ukrainians. There's always something that somebody's not telling us, as it were. In the case of Ukraine, people like Putin and similar ex-KGB, then they became FSB, and of course the former KGB post-1991 FSB are the people ruling Russia today. For them, the revolutions in Georgia, 2003, Ukraine, Orange Revolution, Euromaidan Revolution, were all organized by the CIA. They're absolutely convinced of that. They don't believe that Ukrainians, Georgians have their own agency. They have to be manipulated as puppets by Western intelligence agencies, and the origins of this go back to the Soviet Union, when dissidents and nationalists were always accused of being agents of Western secret services, whether it's CIA, MI6, Mossad even, and that was just a given. The idea that anybody could be an independent actor, a sort of independent nationalist or dissident, was something that they could never accept. And this kind of conspiracy mindset feeds into the Russian imperialist view that Ukrainian identity is fake, and it's been kind of artificially promoted by the CIA, by the West, by the European Union. And this in turn goes back over a century to the idea that the Austrians and Poles did the same thing, to foment a kind of a Ukrainian identity, which was a way of weakening Russia. What this then eventually leads to is the idea that a Ukrainian identity is by its very nature anti-Russia. This is a kind of the phraseology used by Putin on the eve of the full-scale invasion and since, that the Ukraine with an identity different and distinct from Russia and Russians is an identity which has been artificially imposed by a small clique in Ukraine working at the behest of Western intelligence agencies just to prevent Russia from rising from the ashes. Because it's not just Zbigniew Brzezinski who wrote in the 1990s, it's also Russian nationalists who admit that without Ukraine, Russia cannot be a fully fledged empire. I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski said this in the 1990s, and the Russian nationalists agree with him on this question. So the idea being that Ukraine, its size, its agricultural, industrial potential, and its military industrial complex would help Russia to rise from the ashes as this new great power. In slide 4, we have two kind of videos which feed into this kind of Russian complex that they are victims. They've always been victims. They have never been guilty of anything, of course, because they were always asked to intervene. And when they did intervene, they only brought benefits to the peoples they ruled over. In both of these videos, Putin is talking about how the West tried to hoodwink the Russian people, fool them, lie to them. The West is immoral. It's a bunch of hypocrites, whether it's over Kosovo or Iraq. And the West has always tried to break up this unity of the Russian people. Now, what Putin talks about unity, he's talking about a fake unity of little Russian Ukrainians, of white Russian Belarusians, of great Russians who allegedly should belong to one people. And if the Ukrainians are disagreeing with this, which most of them, of course, do, I saw an opinion poll only yesterday that published in an article by Ukrainian sociologists in Foreign Affairs, that less than 5% of Ukrainians today have a positive view of Russians. So how are they going to accept that they are part of a pan-Russian people if 95% or 90% of Ukrainians hold very negative views of Russia and Russian people? This kind of messianic xenophobia against the West, again, of course, it was inherited from the Soviet Union, and it's not surprising it's kind of revived under Putin because the KGB are, after all, in power in Russia. The first kind of clear case of when this came out into the open in a major way was Vladimir Putin's very well-known speech to the Munich Security Conference in February 2007. This came as a response to 3 so-called color revolutions prior to that: the Serbian in 2000, the Georgian 2003, and then the Ukrainian Orange Revolution 2004. Of course, all of these were undertaken by the CIA, this amazing organization that can obviously bring out millions of people on the streets. The idea that the root of this xenophobia against the West is centuries-old Russian inferiority complex. This is what it's all about. Russia has always had this strong inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West, going back to the 18th century or earlier. And the way it compensates to deal with this is by being xenophobically anti-Western, to seek Western conspiracies everywhere, and to claim that Russia is somehow spiritually and culturally superior to the West. I don't personally see this superiority in any way. After all, Russia isn't an exporter of any major technology. Russia's a banana republic in terms of what it exports. It used to export oil, gas, and weapons, and as we know, from the 1st of January of 2025, for the first time in 40 years, Russia no longer exports oil and gas through Ukrainian pipelines to Europe. So how Russia thinks of itself as somehow culturally, spiritually superior, when also it has far worse murder rate, divorce rates, alcoholism, lower life expectancy of its people compared to the West, is beyond anybody's understanding. But this is what is promoted by Putin and Russian nationalists as a way of compensating to deal with that inferiority complex. Putin's speech is also kind of throwing the gauntlet down to say that this part of the world where we live in, the former Soviet Union, Eurasia, however you want to call it, belongs to Russia. Russia is at the center of this Eurasian superior civilization, and Russia demands that the West recognize that this sphere of influence belongs to Russia. Russia has exclusivity, as it were. That means that NATO, European Union, are not allowed to move into this area. It means that United Nations are not allowed to send peacekeeping forces. That Russia does in this area what it wants. It treats its neighbors as not real countries. These are not countries with full sovereignty. They are kind of a very disparaging relationship to to Russia's neighbors. These are countries that need an elder brother to guide them along. Ukraine, of course, is picked on the most in amongst these neighbors, but this attitude, this disparaging attitude to Russia's neighbors is common to all of Russia's neighbors. And you could see that just in December of 2024 in the manner in which Putin and Russia dealt with the crash of the Azerbaijani airline in Kazakhstan. It was flying from Baku to Grozny, and the manner in which they simply lied about what happened and treated the Azerbaijanis with total disrespect. And that obviously is being felt within Azerbaijan on this question. By saying no EU or NATO in Russia's sphere of influence, that obviously focuses on countries like Georgia, Ukraine, which wanted to join NATO, and which were at the brunt of Russian military aggression because of that. Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. Russia has been using the whole Kosovo question for a long period of time. The idea that, the West is hypocritical. It agreed to Kosovo's independence, and yet is claiming that Crimea doesn't have a right to independence. Well, I don't think the comparison is completely right. And anyway, Ukraine has never recognized the independence of Kosovo. So I don't think that this argument that if Kosovo has a right to self-determination, why does Crimea not also? Because Ukraine actually has a similar position to Russia on Kosovo, that it should not have been given independence. But what I think this speech showed was that Russia under Putin was moving further to the nationalist right. So this kind of playing around between Putin and the West, which took place in the first half of the 2000s, has gone. Putin is moving far more to the nationalist right. One of the bugbears of the Putin regime is the idea that Russia has been humiliated, that the West has perennially humiliated Russia throughout history, that this kind of viewpoint even goes further, that Putin agrees with sort of old-fashioned Russian imperial nationalist writers like Ivan Ilyin, a white Russian emigre based in Europe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, who argued that the West always wanted to put down Russia or even destroy Russia. And this view is very common. And the way they say, "We told you so," is when they point to the 1990s. The 1990s is this kind of negative decade in the eyes of Putin's Russian nationalists. This is an example of how the West treated Russia unfairly, humiliated Russia, didn't treat Russia as an equal. But now, with us fighting back, and when we defeat Ukraine, we will defeat this American-led unipolar world. We'll return to the so-called multipolar world which existed in the Cold War. Then the Americans will be forced to treat us, i.e. Russia, as equals, because in the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviet Union were regarded as equals. So this is the kind of extreme logic or rationale floating around Russia. The idea that somehow it's the West that's always at fault is, of course, one of these kind of areas that Putin loves to float around, but it denies and it especially ignores the domestic sources of the problems that Russia has inherited. Not everything is the West's fault. Probably some of it is, but the idea that it's the West that created Russia or transformed Russia into a mafia state is ludicrous. This was Putin. Putin has been in power for 25 years, and he should grow up and be a man and admit responsibility for what he's transformed Russia into. And one of the best examples of this is the fakeness surrounding Russia's army. Russia was supposed to have the second best army in the world. Well, obviously, it's not the second best army. It's the second best army in Ukraine after Ukrainian. And this is a country which is supposed to be a great power with this fantastic army, which had to go with a begging bowl to third world or developing countries like North Korea and Iran to ask for shells, artillery shells, and drones. So this is also a country that's had no choice, had to become China's younger brother. So this kind of lashing out and blaming the West all the time, conveniently, of course, ignores the fact that much of the way Russia looks today is a product of decisions made by Russian leaders themselves, including, of course, Putin, who has now been in power longer than any Russian and any Soviet leader which now, in 2025, will be a quarter of a century. I think another thing that we should bring up here is the degree to which it wasn't just the Russians who were absolutely convinced of how powerful the Russian army was, but it was also Western policymakers and Western so-called experts. There has been a very good study, a long study of this, undertaken by the Washington think tank CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'll make sure that the link is in the footnotes. But this viewpoint that this belief that Russia had the second best army in the world was also believed by these so-called Western experts. Why that was the case is rather bizarre. If we are depicting Russia as a country, as a mafia state, as a totally corrupt, totally ineffectual country, why would the security services and the military be exempt from that? They were obviously affected by this massive amount of corruption. And Russia has been called by US policymakers a mafia state since 2010, so for the last 15 years. And that is clearly the case, and we can clearly see that in the manner in which Russia has been fighting its war against Ukraine. If Russia had had the second best army in the world, Ukraine would have been long ago defeated. But of course, this was all one of the many myths surrounding so-called Russia as a great power. Now, one of the many reasons these Western so-called experts and policymakers were wrong about Ukraine. They also believed that Russia would quickly defeat Ukraine. They were wrong because most of them are Russia experts. They're not Ukraine experts, but they seem to believe that they have a God-given right to comment about Ukraine and the other republics. This is the only region of the world where experts believe that if they are an expert on Russia, they're also an expert on the other 14 countries that came from the former Soviet Union, which is ludicrous, of course. If you're an expert on Russia, why the hell do you think you're an expert on Tajikistan or Georgia, Estonia, and even Ukraine? It would be like saying that, oh, I'm an expert on Brazil, therefore I'm an expert on Latin America or Latin and Central America. that, I think, is one factor. Second factor is that many of these Russianists continue to only use sources from Russia, even though, you know, every country's now sources in Ukraine as well as sources in Russia are all online. You can actually sit in Washington or Berlin or whatever, and you can access those online resources, whether it's Ukrainian or Russian. But nevertheless, practically most of the sources that they access are from Russia, and therefore it's not surprising that they're looking at Ukraine and looking at conflict between Ukraine and Russia through the eyes of Moscow. Another factor is that we still have the continuation, as we had in the Soviet Union, that practically 95% of Western newspapers and magazines have their correspondence in Moscow. And they are supposed to cover the whole former Soviet Union from Moscow. So again, they're going to be looking at those other countries through the eyes of their Russian colleagues, of Russians they talk to, of the Russian media. And the only time they visit places like Ukraine or elsewhere is when there's an election. Final, I think, factor was that there's been an infatuation in the last 30 years amongst Western so-called experts and academics in exaggerating regional and linguistic divisions in Ukraine. And so there was a kind of a belief in many ways, an agreement with Russia about how Ukraine was a weak state and how some kind of large-scale invasion would probably lead to the disintegration or the collapse very quickly of Ukraine as a country. This has been shown to be highly exaggerated both in 2014 and 2022, when most Russian speakers in Ukraine showed themselves to be Ukrainian patriots. So the idea that somehow if you're a Russian speaker in Ukraine, you're going to welcome the Russian army in 2014 or 2022 has been proven to be completely wrong. But this kind of impression of a very weak, a very kind of artificial in many ways, Ukraine divided between East and West, and divided over whether you're a Ukrainian or a Russian speaker, had deep roots not only in Russia but also in the West, and so that was because they were kind of looking at Russia through looking at Ukraine through Russian eyes, because Russian nationalists have always seen Ukraine as kind of divided between a kind of a pro-Russian, Russian-speaking East and South, and a kind of what they call a nationalist, anti-Russian kind of Western and maybe central Ukraine. Again, this is all very simplistic and had nothing to do with reality. Anybody can look at videos that they can find on Twitter or on YouTube from both 2014 and since 2022, and you will see Ukrainian soldiers both speaking Ukrainian and Russian, or sometimes a mixture of the two. So I think this was a mistake. If we if we go on to look at now at Western policies that took place since 2022, one of the mistakes of the Kremlin was to assume that the West would let them again get away with invading Ukraine. The West let Russia get away with invading Georgia in 2008. The West let Russia get away with invading Ukraine in 2014. It wasn't surprising, therefore, and why should it be surprising, that the Kremlin also believed that the West would let them get away with invading again in 2022. The West would slap them on the wrist and say, let's continue business as usual. That is what Russia believed. They were led to believe this by two previous occasions, 2008 and 2014. That didn't happen. And so the Russians were very shocked. Their whole approach to invading Ukraine, this so-called special military operation, collapsed by the Kharkiv counteroffensive in September of 2022. Not only had most Ukrainians not greeted the Russian army as liberators, but the West had reacted in a more tougher manner to the invasion than it had on previous occasions. Yes, it took the West a while to get its act together. The West only really began supplying kind of high-level military equipment from April 2022 onwards. The West was kind of waiting it out to see how the battle for Kiev would take place, and the Russians retreated from the Kiev region beginning in late March of 2022. But that beginning of Western military supplies to Ukraine took place with the background of a lack of really idea of what would be the goal. What would the West's goal be in supporting Ukraine militarily? And this is where I think it's good to divide countries up in the West between how they viewed the war in Ukraine. Countries like Poland, Czech Republic, possibly Romania, certainly the four Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, both of which gave up their neutrality and joined NATO after the full-scale invasion. Norway and Denmark, which had already been NATO members, and Britain, those countries adopted a far more robust and radical view on the war, and those countries, so what we're talking about, 1, 4, 5, 6, 9, around 10 key countries, 3 Baltic states, 4 Scandinavian, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Britain. Those countries outlined from the very beginning that they were not only supporting Ukraine's victory, they were also supporting Russia's military defeat. They openly said this. And that was clear-cut in what they were saying. But two of the biggest countries supporting Ukraine militarily, the US and Germany, never said that. They never said, our goal is Russia's military defeat. For them, the priority was to prevent some kind of nuclear escalation to nuclear weapons, which many people, including myself, thought was always exaggerated. They were also fearful at what would a military defeat of Russia entail. What would happen in Russia if Russia was militarily defeated? They feared this kind of chaos, this civil war potentially inside Russia, and then what would happen to the nuclear weapons in Russia during this chaos and civil war. So the United States under Biden and Germany under Social Democrat Scholz adopted what could be only described as a drip supply of military equipment. This was sufficient for Ukraine to not be militarily defeated, but insufficient for Ukraine to win victory. So in effect, this would be a policy of Ukraine fulfilling a never-ending war, because the war would have no end, which would be terrible for Ukraine. It would lead to more and more destruction, refugees never returning home, economy continuously being on a knife edge, and of course, ever more civilian and military casualties. So this never-ending war as a product of a drip Western military supplies is not something that would be great for Ukraine. But this was what Germany and America were offering. things are now changing. Scholz will be replaced in February in the German elections by the leader of the Christian Democrats. And we have a new president in the United States who takes office at the end of January, Donald Trump. So this is likely to change. How it will change, we can talk about later. But this kind of fear on the part of the US, the Biden fear, is very reflective and brings a sense of deja vu to myself, to going back to 1990. In 1990-91, President Bush Sr., the father of George Bush, who also feared this kind of what's going to happen if the USSR disintegrates, which of course it looked like he was doing in 1990-91, especially with Ukraine promoting its independence. And President Bush came to Kiev. And on August 1st, 1991, he gave his famous, what was dubbed Chicken Kiev speech to the Ukrainian parliament, warning against the threat of Ukrainian nationalism. Ukrainians, of course, ignored him and declared independence 24 days later on the 24th of August. But nevertheless, this American fear, as we can see, is not a purely Democratic Party fear, because George Bush back in 1990-91 was a Republican, and here we have Biden, the Democrats. It was an exaggerated fear, I think, on the part of the US now and even then, because when the USSR disintegrated in December 1991, it was relatively peaceful. There weren't that many conflicts. Certainly Ukraine had Ukraine had a huge Soviet military presence at that time. Something like over 750,000 people, troops were based in Ukraine. And Ukraine had I believe then it would have been the second or third largest the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world after Russia and the United States. At that stage, Ukraine had more nuclear weapons than China. But there was no chaos. There was no civil war. They were Russian-backed conflicts, Russian-staged conflicts in Transnistria region of Moldova and in Georgia. And then the most bloody conflict was between Armenia and Azerbaijan, with Russia backing Armenia. But if you look at the entire former Soviet space, I mean, these three conflicts were in a minority of the whole territory. So I think that Biden's fear, if we look back at what happened when the USSR disintegrated in December 1991, was highly exaggerated, and to the detriment of Ukraine, of course. One of the areas which was different in 2022 compared to 2014 and, of course, 2008 was the question of sanctions. Sanctions were far tougher on Russia compared to 2014. Sanctions in 2014 were largely, you could actually even call them quite comical. Countries continue to do business with Russia. Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline continued to be built by Germany and Russia. So the sanctions imposed on Russia in 2022 were certainly going very different and certainly closer to what had been earlier imposed against Iran. Nevertheless, there is still widespread debate to what degree these Western sanctions have been influential on the Russian economy, which has still managed to escape a lot of the impact of those sanctions because of many countries re-exporting Western goods to Russia. And the four culprits in Eurasia which have been doing this are Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Georgia. Other countries outside have been United Arab Emirates, Turkey to a mixed degree, but China is certainly the main country which has been enabling Russia's military machine. China denies this, saying that it was only sending dual-use goods, but nevertheless, these dual-use goods are very important for Russia's military machine. If China was to tomorrow to end its massive increase in trade with Russia since 2022, the Russian military could no longer really operate its war against Ukraine. China and India have also been the main beneficiaries of cheaper Russian oil, which is no longer purchased by Europe. Yes, it's true to say that Europe has removed, or most of Europe has removed oil and gas imports, which accounted for a whacking, nearly 50%, 40% of the Russian budget up until 2022. But three countries at least, Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia, continued to import Russian energy through Ukraine because Russia and Ukraine had a 5-year contract for the transit of gas from 2019 to 2024. That's now ended. Austria, though, pulled out of that a few months ago before this Russian-Ukrainian gas transit contract ended. So it's just Hungary and Slovakia that were left in the lurch, as it were, having to find alternative sources. Probably an indirect impact of the war and maybe of sanctions has been on Russian military exports. The manner in which the war has shown Russian military equipment to not be of high standard and high quality has led to a number of countries cutting back on importing Russian military equipment, including one of the biggest, India, which has been importing Soviet and then after 1991 Russian military equipment for decades. So that is surely a major loss for Russia. It is unclear why Western countries, particularly the United States and the European Union, have not been tougher on countries which are facilitating this re-export of sanctioned goods to Russia. It's not just the fact that there are countries acting as middlemen like Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Why are there no sanctions against those four countries? Why does Armenia always get away with it? Why is Armenia being touted as a country that wants to move away from Russia, move towards Europe, when in fact Armenian-Russian trade has ballooned since 2022? That's not really a sign that Armenia is moving away from Russia and moving to Europe. On the contrary. But why are countries like Germany, for example, and Italy and others, whose exports have increased massively to these sanction busters like Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, why is the EU not stepped in and said to the Germans and the Italians and others, you do realize that these countries like Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and elsewhere are too small to absorb all of these imports, and the majority of these imports are then re-exported to Russia. So you're actually breaking Western sanctions. Why the EU is not doing that is beyond me and many others. On a final note, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how is the war going to end? And this is going to be a major question this year, 2025. We have new Western leaders coming into power in Germany and in the US. Germany and the US have been the biggest providers of military equipment to Ukraine the last few years. Germany overtook Great Britain in this respect. And there are some who fear that Donald Trump will sell out Ukraine. I think this is a mistaken view. I think it's a far more nuanced view of what will actually take place. I don't think that Trump really wants to have the rest of his presidency with a big grey cloud over his head like Biden had when we had a chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in July of 2021. That really impacted on how the world, and in particular Russia, looked upon Biden. I don't think Trump wants to have the same kind of grey cloud of, say, for example, Ukrainian defeat. The other question we have to ask is who would be the biggest beneficiary of some kind of Trump proposal for ending the war? These proposals have not been concrete until now. We've had various kind of ideas of where they will take the war. One of them is that the US will demand that both Russia and Ukraine will sit down and begin negotiating an end to the war. Good luck with the US demanding that to Russia, because Putin will never kind of just bow his head and accept what the Americans are telling him to do. That would go against all of his kind of anti-Western xenophobia. But more importantly, what the Americans are proposing, which is a freezing of the conflict line, kind of benefits Ukraine far more than it benefits Russia. In fact, both President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov have both already come out and said that they cannot agree to Trump's so-called peace proposals. And they've listed a few key areas, but there are probably other areas which I'll go into now, which are also important. Firstly, the freezing of the conflict along the current line is not something that Russia particularly is interested in. It would defeat the whole objective of Russia's initial invasion. Russia's initial invasion goals, the so-called denazification, were the destruction of Ukraine as a state, its transformation into a kind of a little Russian puppet state controlled by Moscow, so a kind of a Ukrainian version of Lukashenko running Kiev, who's beholden to Putin, and the destruction of this separate identity which claims that Ukrainians are a distinct people to Russians. That is out, that would be out, and in its place would be this little Russian identity where little Russians would be a branch of the pan-Russian people. So the idea that the conflict would be frozen and thereby 80% of Ukraine would continue to develop this Ukrainian identity, continue to integrate into Europe and to the West, and Russia would never be happy with that. In fact, Lavrov and Putin have both come out and said the idea that we're okay with Ukraine postponing NATO membership for 20 years is not on the cards. Russia demands that Ukraine forever says that it will never join NATO. It'll become a so-called neutral state. By neutral, what they mean is a Russian puppet state. They don't mean neutrality in the sense of Austria in the Cold War. Other reasons why Russia wouldn't agree to a freezing of the conflict lines is that Russia doesn't control the entire territory of the 4 regions it's claiming. So Russia does not control the entire region of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. But the closest Russia controls most of the region is Luhansk, but it still doesn't control 100%. Russia is not only demanding that in agreement to sit down and talk peace, that Ukraine give to Russia the areas of those 4 regions that Ukraine controls, but also Russia is demanding that Ukraine recognize these territories as being now Russian. Ukraine will do neither step. Ukraine will never give over to Russia the territories it controls in, say, Kherson, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia Oblast, firstly. And it's forbidden in the Ukrainian constitution for the defender of Ukraine's territorial integrity, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, from recognizing parts of Ukraine as belonging to a foreign country. So that's simply not on the cards. And it would be opposed by a majority of Ukrainians. So all of these kind of Russian demands, or what the Russian goals were from the war, are ruled out by Trump so-called peace proposals, and therefore it's not surprising that the Russian side will not agree with this. On the Ukrainian side, I think that they could potentially be a public support, and support even for Zelensky, that yes, we'll go into some peace agreement. We understand that 20% of our land is temporarily occupied. We will never recognize that. It was temporarily occupied by Russia in return for some benefits. Those benefits are going to have to be, of course, security guarantees or NATO membership. But certainly, even the Trump team, as well as others like in Europe, talk about the need to give Ukraine a military edge to then go into negotiations with Russia with a better position. And so it's very likely that the Trump administration would actually increase military support to Ukraine at the beginning, prior to any potential negotiations. So this is actually certainly not going to be a peace agreement which is concluded in 24 hours, as Trump once said. It is going to be far more complicated, and the biggest obstacle is going to be not Ukraine, but it's going to be Russia here. The importance for Ukraine of ending the war relatively quickly are obvious. Yes, the downside is that 20% of its territory continues to be temporarily occupied by Russia. That's the downside. The plus sides are, there's a huge list of them. The ability to rebuild the country without Russian attacks, the ability to invite refugees back, and there are millions of them living in Western Europe, back to Ukraine, the ability of children to no longer have to go into the metro to do their daily schooling, they can go back to schools, and of course, fewer buildings destroyed, utilities working and people not shivering in their homes, and importantly, an end to civilian and military casualties. All of these are factors which are going to would be positive for Ukraine. How the West and Europe, United States, would be able to force Russia to stop its military aggression is another question. I think the other big question is where will the troops come from? I mean, there are only 2 options. One option is for the 80% of Ukraine, which is free, to join NATO. So this would be, shall we say, the West German option. West Germany in 1955 joined NATO, even though East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union. So this would be the kind of a similar, shall we say, approach. That doesn't seem to be possible at the moment, at least. Everything could change, because both Germany and the United States were the main blockages on Ukraine joining NATO. It's not true to say, like Mark Galeotti and other Russianists claim, that most NATO members are against. In fact, this is the highest number of NATO members ever which support Ukraine's membership of NATO, including France, which has changed in the last few years. The two key countries which have been blocking Ukraine joining NATO are the US and Germany. The German position could change with the Christian Democrats coming to power in February. The Trump administration, at the moment at least, is opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. But they're opposed to that only because they think that if they support Ukraine joining NATO, that will stop Russia coming to the negotiating table. But if Russia's not anyway coming to the negotiating table, why not bring Ukraine into NATO? That would, for definite, end the war immediately. Russia would never have the ability or the willingness to attack a country inside NATO. If NATO is not an option, NATO membership, then that there is talk of some kind of security guarantees. But yes, the problem with security guarantees is that it requires a continued high level of supply of military equipment to Ukraine. That's possible, maybe, because that could be also American as well as European. But on terms of the troops which would be, as it were, patrolling this very, very long frozen conflict line, the Americans and the Trump, by here I mean the Trump administration, have said it would not be Americans, it would be Europeans. So the Europeans would have to come up with 50 to 60,000 troops. Is that really possible? Is that feasible? When we have most countries in European NATO just beginning to increase their troop levels and their spending on defense. It would certainly have to come from the big players, maybe some Scandinavian countries, maybe Poland, France, Britain. But Britain, for example, has one of the smallest armies it's ever had for the last couple of 100 years. So this could be a potential problem in ensuring that security guarantees actually work. Certainly, I think that it's interesting that Ukrainians have a more favorable view or outlook of what potentially could transpire with Trump and peace plan and security guarantees and weapon supplies than Russia has. There's really nothing in the Trump peace plans which really works to Russia's favor. And from that point of view, I think it's very likely that Ukraine could be the main beneficiary of any of these Trump peace proposals. Certainly, I cannot see how the Kremlin would agree to any of the proposals that currently are coming out of the Trump team. On that note, I will end. If you were going to give the West a grade on how it how it dealt with the full-scale invasion, I would say something like A- or B+. I think quite a few analysts would be arguing that that if the West had been more robust, especially in 2022, the war could have been over by now. And it's the fault of particularly the Germans and the United States, which were too afraid of defeating Russia, that the war dragged out. If the West, and this is something I'll leave this lecture on, if the West in September or the autumn of 2022, when Russian troops were running away from Kharkiv, and then they ran away from Kherson in November of 22, if the West had and by the West here I mean the Germans and the Americans, if they had at that stage said, this is our moment, we're going to give them, Ukrainians, everything that we have, Russia would have been defeated. There's simply no question. At that moment in time, Russia had only 170,000 troops in Ukraine. Russia had not yet mobilized. So Russia's response to the catastrophic collapse of its forces in Kharkiv was to launch a mass mobilization of 300,000 troops. This, of course, led to 1 million Russians fleeing abroad. And Russia then began building fortifications in southeastern Ukraine. That kind of very strong passivity on the part of the United States and Germany over the next 8 to 9 months, between, shall we say, autumn of 22 and the summer of 2023, when Ukraine launched its counteroffensive, allowed the Russians to rebuild themselves as a occupying force in Ukraine. As of today, the Russian army in Ukraine is 3 times what it was in 2022. The Russian army in Ukraine today is at least 450,000, something like this. Back then it was 170,000. Ukrainian army in 2022, with that massive influx of weaponry, could have defeated that 170,000 Russian troops, and there were no fortifications and minefields in the way of Ukrainian forces simply moving south to the Azov Sea. That opportunity was lost. And then when Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in June of 23, it was too late. The offensive was a failure. Russia had already mobilized a huge number of troops, increased its troop presence in Ukraine. It had built these 3 lines of fortifications. It had laid a huge minefield, and therefore the war has been stalemated ever since then. And if we had continued with the Biden-Schultz approach of drip, drip, feed of weaponry, this would have continued as a forever war. So it's good that there potentially will be a breakthrough somehow in 2025. I think that the Trump team are becoming to realize this will be more difficult than they imagined. Trump has actually said that resolving the Ukraine-Russian war is more difficult than resolving the Middle East, and that's a lot to say for it. I think just with 2 final notes, which will lead us on to the last lecture, is that there are 2 areas where Trump will be more tougher on, which will be advantageous to Ukraine. One will be Iran. There's very strong possibility that the Trump team will give the green light to Israel to launch a more ferocious attack on Iran. Iran is already reeling from Israeli attacks against its proxy forces. Israel has decapitated both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. I wouldn't be surprised at all if both the Trump team and Israel would be interested in some kind of regime change in Iran. That would be to Ukraine's benefit. Iran is already reeling from losing its proxy country of Syria under Assad. Assad was overthrown by opposition forces in December of 2024. So anything that brings down or the regime in Iran or weakens even more the Iranian regime is to Ukraine's benefit, because Iran is a major military supplier and cooperator with Russia. And the second factor is China. The Trump team want to, as it were, resolve the Ukraine-Russian war. One of the major reasons they want to resolve it is then they can focus on what they see as the main threat of China. China, as I've said, is the main external enabler of Russia's military machine. So any American kind of tougher stances towards China will inevitably be good for Ukraine as well, and that could be by increasing the amount of sanctions. The Biden administration was quite weak in imposing sanctions on China in comparison to what we are likely to see from the Trump administration. So this kind of takes us into the next lecture and shows you to what degree 2025 will be a key decisive year in this war, and hopefully one which will be positive for Ukraine's outcome. Thank you.